The source sheet will arrive momentarily, I hope. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm very excited and honored to be here with you in Matan. I wanted to take a moment to make two announcements before we start the actual class. First and foremost, today's classes are dedicated to the memory of Mirna Sharansky. And I know that some of you knew her personally. I didn't have that privilege, but I do know her daughter. We davened together in the same community. And she always spoke very, very fondly and with great admiration of her mother. And I am glad to learn today in her memory. So we can may her neshama have an oviyah. The other announcement has to do with the Zoom. We have a little bit of a technical malfunction right now. The sound doesn't work, meaning you can hear me, but if you raise questions or speak up, I can't hear you. Hopefully it will be fixed and I will make an announcement as soon as it is, and I apologize for that. Okay, delving right in. So Sefer Shemot is not exactly an unknown quantity to most of us, right? It's one of the books that not only do we read it as Parshat Shavua, we then pick apart its story and relearn it. For Pesach and Haggadah, we mention Yetziat Mitzrayim all the time. The problem with stories and books that are so well known is that at some point it's easy to stop actually paying attention to them. And we start knowing the things that we knew about them. And then we start knowing kind of the midrashim. And then at some point, it's easy to lose touch with what's actually happening in the book itself. So what we're going to try and do this year in this class, in this course, is go back to the pshat, go back to the basics of the book of Shemot and actually read through it and ask yourself some questions that are not necessarily the questions that the Parshanim ask or that the rabbis in Haggadah Shel Pesach ask, and ask, what is this about? What kind of experience are we privy to? What did the people we are reading about, those ancient Israelites in Egypt, actually experience? What were their needs? What were their concerns? Why did they respond the way they responded, and how could they have responded differently? And the overall question we're going to try and tackle is, what did they need in order to become free? What was it that God was trying to achieve in every step of the way as he and his emissaries were doing things that range from political speeches, diplomatic negotiations, educational measures, and a lot of punitive measures towards the people themselves. So that's just to put it a little bit in context. And before we delve actually in and start biting into the text, I want to ask you a question. When I say the word enslavement or slavery, what are the first associations that jump into your mind? Yes.
Well, there's a problem. Over the years, everyone always talks about it as if it was the 18th century, 19th century. But actually, the more I learned Tanakh, I realized that it's a form of employment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the American slavery. People basically make a deal. And if you work, there are certain jobs, not everyone has great jobs, even today. And you find yourself enslaved by your contract.
What's your name? Sorry.
Batya Mindat.
Batya. So just a second. So I'm just repeating it for the benefit of our friends in Zoom. Batya says that part of the problem is that we think of slavery very much through the prism of 18th, 19th century slavery, specifically the slavery of Afro-Americans in America often. Whereas in the ancient world, it was often a form of employment, like indentured servants. I would argue that even in the ancient world, there was a very wide array, that the word Eved applied to a very wide array of situations. Some of them indeed more like indentured service, and some of them very much like captive of wars being sold in market, regardless of their desire. So there's a very broad spectrum. So thank you for drawing our attention to this. Yes.
The lack of control of your own time and self-worth.
Thank you. Your name?
Marion Shalansky.
Marion?
Shalansky.
Marion Shalansky. Thank you. So Marion points out that it's a lack of control and your time, your self-worth, what you do with your time, which is definitely very true. Any other answers? Any other thoughts here? The source sheets are being handed out, by the way.
Subjugation.
Subjugation. Thank you. Your name? Sharon. So Sharon points out subjugation. What's important about the word subjugation, and the reason I think it's important that you brought it into conversation here, is that it implies an active process on the side of someone oppressing the other. Slavery can be a deceptively passive word. You know, you happen to be a slave. Subjugation, you can feel the thrum of action here. And as we will see now when we start reading the first chapter of Exodus, the story of slavery there definitely focuses on someone pushing for it. It's a story of enslavement and not just passive slavery. Any other thoughts? It can be anything, any association. Thank you. In your mind. Okay, so we'll come back to these concepts that you raised in a bit. And next week, we're going to start unpacking how God goes about liberating these slaves. But before we do that, today, what we're going to focus on is trying to understand in what way are they, thank you so much, in what ways are they in fact slaves? Are they in the indentured servants camp or captives of war camp? What does it mean? What is their experience of it? Who drives the subjugation? I mean, we all know the answer to that, right? Spoiler alert, part O, but there's more than that. There's forces in play that are deeper than that. And what we're going to do today is try and unpack them, try and really dig into the beginning of Shemot and understand how the family that came into Egypt by invitation of the viceroy of Egypt, their brother Yosef, ends up as the slaves that God then needs to come and pluck out with his outstretched hand, etc., etc. I'm going to start reading the first box in your source sheet before you. I'll read in the English and sometimes in the Hebrew. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household. So is there anything that stands out to you about this pasuk? Anything peculiar?
Sons of Israel and Jacob, aren't they the same person?
Exactly. Israel and Jacob are the same person. Why do we need, first of all, why is it so important to mention that they came with their father, right? Et Yaakov Ishu Beit Lavan, with Jacob. And secondly, why is it important to include both names of Jacob in the first, we'll get to it in a second, just think.
Sons and daughters, or husband and wife,
female.
male and female.
I'm sorry, you're saying that it's not mentioned?
Yes, sons
Mhm.
includes their wives.
Yeah, correct. It includes their wives, includes their families, and that's all implied in that with his household, each coming with his household. But it is remarkable that the focus is very much on the sons of Jacob as such. And Jacob is mentioned in both names. Yes.
Sons of Israel and Jacob, it's two separate people. He became a different person than the king of Israel.
So you're mentioning that when Jacob became Israel, it was a transformation of the self. And it's true. It
But he
was,
was still the same person.
yeah, physically he was the same person, but he was a new essence. He had a new essence. It's definitely how the angel describes it when he names it. He says, now you're going to be known in a new name. And yet the question is, why is the biblical storyteller choosing to bring both of these aspects of Jacob into play? Why do we carry with us into Egypt Jacob and Israel? Yes.
The Bnei Israel is like the brand name.
Mhm.
It's the name for the entire people. And within that people, you have Yaakov himself as an individual.
So you're saying that Bnei Israel is a brand name for the people, which is true, but it will become true later. Here, it's kind of a foreshadowing. We're not talking about a people yet. At this point, we're still talking just about a family. So you could say that here they're already Bnei Israel. Saying Bnei Israel, the biblical storyteller is already using what will later become a descriptor for the entire people to kind of imply that even though we're looking at a family, the story we're about to hit on is the story of the birth of a nation, a group. Yes.
I don't think it's referring to the entire people, but simply labeling these brothers, Bnei Israel, and they're not saying Bnei Yaakov because it's been a switch, because it's already been foreseen. They're going to become a people. And it would have been possible that they came without Yaakov. But it mentioned, no, he physically was there with them.
Correct. All of these aspects are important, but they're already Bnei Israel because they're no longer Bnei Yaakov. He's not Yaakov anymore. He's Israel, right? He means something else. But we need to know that he came with them, and yet he could have said, I'm going to reread it and change one word. ואלה שמות בני ישראל הבאים מצרימה, את ישראל איש וביתו באו. And the Tanakh, the biblical storyteller, the Torah is not scared of using the same word twice in the Pasuk at all. Like it's a big consideration in English language poetry. In Hebrew, it's just, in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, it's never a consideration. Like they're happy to repeat the same word if it works better for the meaning. You know, let's leave it for a second. Let's leave it dangling kind of as a question. Why are both names here? Why are they described as the son of Israel, but he is described simply as Yaakov? And we'll get back to it. Let's keep reading the list. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, Zvulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all that generation. There's another peculiar thing about the list. There's many peculiar things about the list, excuse me. But one thing that stands out, if you read it immediately after reading their sheet, and not like we're reading it now as its own beginning, and that is that we already saw this list. This story already happened. Again, the Torah doesn't waste words. It's not afraid of reusing the same word if that's the right word to use. And it's not afraid of leaving long swath of events out, or emotions, or the interior monologue of the heroes out if it's not the important bit of the story. Torah has no problem with that. So why start again on the same list? Why do we need to start the book about slavery and freedom with this list? Any thoughts?
Not in the regular order, I think.
It's also not in regular order, right?
Isn't there some difference between the end of Reshit where the list is mentioned and this? I don't remember exactly, but I seem to recall there is a.
Yes, there is a difference. We're not going to focus on that, but you're right, there is a difference. And when we go into the drush, it's very interesting from it. Any other thoughts about why we need this list here? Okay, so I want to put it in a little bit of a storytelling context, okay? In storytelling, the work of the storyteller is not merely to recount events, right? The work of the storyteller is to take what is otherwise a pile of things, people's thoughts, people's actions, people's descriptions, things that happen, settings, and build them into something that feels coherent to us. Now, imagine, for example, if you were in a room, in a restaurant, let's say a busy room, a restaurant, yeah, Capit or something like that, and you put a tape recorder there for an hour. Would whatever you get, the transcription of this recording, would that count as a story? No, it's boring, it's full of minutia, and we don't know what we're supposed to be paying attention to. In fact, if you were to try and read such a story, and there's been some experiments done about things like that, not exactly this scenario, you would feel very frustrated because your mind would keep trying to look for a pattern. Our mind is so trained, so ingrained, it's so ingrained in us that when we are seeing a story, we're supposed to find a pattern that makes sense to us and follow it. But when we see something without a pattern, it just causes a headache. It just frustrates us. And the way a storyteller does it, the way a storyteller manages to take events and things and put them together is by creating guides that then lead us through the story. And these guides are our expectations. The beginning of a story creates certain expectations. And these expectations are like little guides that make us pay attention more carefully to certain parts. Sometimes they make us surprised because something happens that goes against our expectation, and then that draws our attention to something else. So when the Torah chooses to begin the book of Shemot with something that we already know, namely the story of these people going into Egypt, and the list of names we already saw, it's not simply giving us a history lesson because we already got that history. It is setting our expectations. It is priming us to pay attention to certain things. Yes.
Perhaps the specificity of the names suggests that they will be continued as individual names, or we know as tribes.
Okay, this is very good. You're saying that the specificity of the names hints to us or creates a certain expectation that even though they're all going into Egypt together, they're still going to retain their identity as Yehuda, Issachar, Zebulun is going to mean something moving forward. Just as, by the way, I think that the words Bnei Israel in the beginning, even though at this point they don't mark a nation yet, might foreshadow or create an expectation that we, the readers, who obviously are looking at it for the benefit of history and know that Bnei Israel as a nation exists, right, are like, oh, this is going to be the story of how this nation came to be out of these people who yet retain their specificity. I want to broaden the question a little bit. The very fact that we're focusing on their names here, right? So one way it affects us is by making us think that the specificity will matter moving forward. What other expectations does it create?
We'll figure out what's going, we want to know what's going to happen to these people, but these are the roots. Where they're going and what's going to happen. And as you pointed out, as they become an Israel nation.
Yeah, so it gives us protagonists. Is that what you're, sorry, what's your name?
Shulami.
Shulam, thank you. It gives us people we want to follow in storytelling language. We call it root for. Just a second. Yes.
It seems that Yaakov is considered just another one of those coming because Yosef took over leadership, and that's why he's listed the way he's listed.
It's interesting you say so, that Yaakov is coming because he's no longer leading them. I would argue that Yosef is a little, I mean, when you start reading, at least until you reach the 5th verse, right, when Yosef is mentioned, it's almost bizarre that Yosef isn't mentioned first, right? Because we know what actually happened. What actually happened is that Yosef was there first, right? And he pulled all of them. So we could say, ואלה שמות בני ישראל באים מצרים את יעקב בשבטו באו אל יוסף, or something like that. But the emphasis is less on Yosef and more on his brothers, it says. The brothers are now the first people we meet. The father is someone who goes with them instead of the leader. And Yosef is mentioned in the end, not as he who brought them, but as someone who was already there. Which is another interesting reconstruction of the story. Yes.
I was just wondering, if you're talking about storytelling, the brothers, when they were single individuals, had dynamics. So I'm wondering if that could be, you were saying expectations. Perhaps we can expect certain dynamics between the tribes as they are in Egypt based on their name.
So it's interesting. So you're saying that we can expect certain dynamics between the brothers. I would say that this expectation is created less by this and more by what we remember from Bereshit. Since we're coming into it straight from Bereshit, we're like, wait a minute, these people never had an easy relationship. How are things going to play out between them moving forward? Yes.
I feel like there's times up the Yosef and his brother's stories to me. He brought Yaakov down, right? That was, they were coming together. Gave him on to that whole story, and Yosef was there. So for me, these first psukim are like a replay of the Yosef and his brothers story.
You're right. It's a replay of the Yosef and the story. Yosef and his brothers are union, but it's also with significant differences. Because we actually don't hear anything about the dynamic between them. What we hear is that Yosef was already there. Yes. Yeah.
So I think, to me, it's the almost shocking contradistinction to what happens after this Pesach, that everybody loses names. Our mom is Ish Levi, but his wife is Bat Levi, and the first ones with names after that are Shifra and Pua. In other words, it's almost like talking that the enslavement mentality makes people lose their individuality. And it's only until Shifra and Pua, who took methods of their own, that they're actually named again. So I think that's one of the interesting lead-ins to what happens when they first come down and what happens after years of slavery.
Thank you. What's your name? Sorry.
Michelle.
Rochelle. So Rochelle is pointing out that what's shocking almost is not the list of names, but the fact that these names disappear. And I want to really pause on this for a minute. I'll open the what we call it, the stage for more comments and thoughts in a minute. But I want to pause on that because this is really crucial. As I mentioned before, sometimes expectations are guides in the sense that they make you notice things you expect to see, and sometimes they're guides by priming you to be surprised. And I think this is what's happening here. We have this plethora of names. We even have Israel and Yaakov, as if both names that can be brought are brought forth, right? We ask, why do they need both names? We have all the names, not the women, of course, but not the daughters, not the wives, yes. But all the names of the main players of the story are there, even both aspects of Yaakov. And then, as soon as we see that Vayamat Yosef that Yosef and his brothers and all the generation died, the names disappear from the story. Let's keep reading, you can see it happening. I'm in verse 7. I'm going to read in the Hebrew and you have the English right next to it. ובני ישראל פרו וישרצו וירבו ויעצמו במאוד מאוד ותמלא הארץ אותם. The sons of Israel, in the English translation here it says the Israelites, but here it still says the sons of Israel, and a second ago the sons of Israel was a literal descriptor, the sons of the man named Israel, right? But here all of a sudden we're no longer talking about them. Now we already see the same phrase, Israel, changing its meaning and coming to represent a group. And it has a group, it has a name, it has a title, the Son of Israel. But the individuals within it are described not as Mr. This, Mrs. That, whatever the names are. Rather, they're described almost in animalistic terms. Paru, va'ishretzu, va'irbu, va'yetzmu. Paru v'ravu is the biblical way of saying they procreated and multiplied. But ishretzu invokes the word shares, right? And how would you translate shares? Creepy crawly. I like that. Creepy crawly. That's cute. I'll be sure to mention that to my 5-year-old because I love it. So ishretzu, not really the word we usually use to describe human procreation. It's like, what? Suddenly we're talking about these people who a second ago were named individuals with relationships to each other, the brothers of, the sons of. And suddenly we're talking about this animalistic force that's multiplying and filling the earth. Yes.
But that's also a foreshadowing of how the Egyptians saw them. Right?
Exactly.
It gives us the background to understand their point of view.
Exactly. It gives us the background to understand the Egyptian point of view. Which, by the way, I want to pause here and remark on how interesting it is, but it's very easy to vilify Paro and present him as an unreasonable tyrant, and definitely his later actions. I mean, very quickly his actions become horrible and terrible, and you can't condone it in any way. But how remarkable is it that the biblical storyteller here is giving us a little bit of an understanding of where Paro is coming from? Because if we distance ourselves from this story for a second and forget that it's our story, right? Our history, our story, and think of it instead as, a story we've never read before, we can put ourselves in the Egyptians' shoes, like you see people who came as, one little family, 70 people, it's not little, but still it's a family, into your country, and suddenly they filled the earth, like the land was filled with them. Wouldn't you be a little bit alarmed? At the same time, it's also telling us, it's giving us a hint to a perversity in the way the Egyptians see them. Because we see already here hinted, as you said, in place, we kind of get a hint that the way the Egyptians see them is a way that dehumanizes them. They're not seeing them as, oh, here are these people and there's a lot of them. What should we do about the fact that there's a lot of them? They see them as an animalistic force that fills the earth. And when you see someone as an animalistic force that fills the earth, the solutions you'll come up with are very different than if you look at them and see this person and this person and this person. Okay, you want to see?
Yes. It is almost similar to the situation that's occurring in Europe today, where Europe is trying to be kind and absorb as many refugees as they can. And at the beginning, well, it was an act of kindness, but very quickly it became, oh my goodness, we're being overwhelmed. And we might even lose our nationality as we know it because of all these foreigners, different color, different religions. I can relate to it.
Yes, it's an
They have a
excellent.
negative birth rate.
It's
Ways that they have people to do the work.
an excellent point. And by the way, what you're saying about what we're seeing today, the crisis of refugees from Syria, say, from Sudan. We have it here. Also, it's not here much less than in Germany, for example, but we have it right here. It raises questions that rise up whenever there's big immigration in history, which is like, wait a minute, this is us. This is who we are. And it's the tension between being kind and being afraid.
The fear of the other.
Yes.
The fear of the other, but it's, I mean, yes, there's fear of the other, but there's also the legitimate fear of losing what you have. By the way, I'm jumping way ahead for a second. Well, not ahead, all the way to our days, ahead to Chumash Bamidbar, so not as dramatic, perhaps. But in Chumash Bamidbar, we see another king seeing something similar and freaking out, and that is Balak ben Zippor, king of Moab. He also looks at the Israelites filling the plain, and his fear is described in very poetic terms. Instead of just saying he was scared, so he felt that it's an ox that's going to eat all the greenery. Like he feels like they're going to lick off the entire food that Moab depends on. So we see time and time again that the Israelites, by being this other people who are close in your space as a sovereign nation, they evoke some fear. And here's the first time we see it because here's the first time we can talk about them as a nation or as a group. Yes.
So it would be easier for me to accept the dehumanization on the part of Paro and the leadership had this been in a different order. In other words, here it's the narrative, it's the narrator who's talking, using this language about them. If it had said right after Vayamat Yosef, the Kol Esav, and then it said Vayakam Melech Hadash, and a new king arose who did not know Joseph, and then Bnei Israel, and using this language to describe how they were multiplied. For me, the order doesn't fit in terms of the relationship between them and Pharaoh or the Egyptians, because again, it's the narrator who's using that language, it's the Torah language of it, rather than the Egyptian language.
That's a very good point. And it's important to notice that when we follow how expectations are formed and frustrated, when we follow the dynamics of, oh, sorry, yes, I'll repeat that. Thank you. That, sorry, Sharon, right? Sharon points out that there's something weird about the order. If it would have said Joseph and his brothers died, a new Pharaoh arose who didn't remember Joseph, and the people multiplied, then it would have been his perspective. It would have been a characterization of Paro's perspective on the situation. But the fact is that Paro is not even in the story yet, right? Where he's not mentioned. At this point, he's not a relevant person. At this point, it's the Bible itself, the biblical storyteller telling us in these terms, and these animalistic terms, and the way they sheltsu, like creepy crawlies that fill the earth, right? And what does it mean? What does it stand for? So I want to turn the question to you. Why do you think it's not Paro describing them, but rather the way the Tanakh itself describes the Jews at this point, before Paro even enters the story. Any thoughts? Yes.
That would be the reason why the Paro turned against them, because they were so overwhelmingly overcoming in the country.
So I think you're saying that maybe that's why, to show us why Paro turned against them. I think there is an element of that, but the Torah is carefully making sure that we see where Paro is coming from. And I'll come back to why this is important in a second, why it's important to show that there is an objective reality he's responding to. Yes.
If I remember correctly, Paro's invitation was not supposed to be stay forever. It was just during the difficult times and then you go back.
Wasn't.
There's nothing.
Yes.
What?
Yosef's invitation.
Yeah, but Yosef didn't do it independently.
No, Yosef had to have Paro's permission for
Because
that.
Paro was invited, basically invited. He accepted them, but it was not to take over forever.
So, okay, but this, you're right, that it's not clear. There's a little bit of ambiguity about what Paro meant when he
Well, I
invited people.
predicted some sort of punishment of being exiled. So this was God's plan, but it wasn't Paro's plan.
We'll get back to that. Okay, we'll get back to the tension there. Yes.
I don't know if this is a political thing, but I believe at that period of time, there were different dynasties of pharaohs, and Pharaoh himself might have been in danger, of a new group taking over. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of story, like in Egyptian history, there are dynasties taking over other dynasties. It's not 100% clear where exactly the timeline is. So, I mean, there's a lot of Rabbi Sachs holds strongly by the position that it's Ramses III, that the evil Paro is Ramses III, who kind of took Egypt and really raised up the stakes, really built a lot of the magnificent structures and made it a much richer civilization, et cetera, et cetera. But let's leave it aside for a second, just a moment. What I'm hearing from several of you is that we're still focusing on the importance of this statement that they filled the earth as an illumination for why Paro thought this way later. But before we continue this discussion, can we pause for a second and look at it on its own right? Ignore for a second what happens later with Paro. Why is it important for the storyteller to show us that they lose their individuality? Any thoughts? Yes.
That's what they're called. If you say God called them that, look what God called them. So that has a very negative connotation is who people really became. They came one way, and over the years they sort of assimilated and they became completely different.
You're saying that I'm sorry, I'm gonna rephrase it just for the benefit of everybody, that the fact that the text here calls them, it doesn't call them Shretzi, it just says Shretzu, which is a strong connotation, yeah. But it's telling us that they're already undergoing some process that's negative before Paro steps into the picture.
And I think that's how they began to see themselves in a certain way. It's not pleasant to say, but I think they began to have a negative self-image also, or, lose some of their princely qualities, whatever you.
Princely qualities, I like that. You're saying that the people themselves already started losing their self-image as individual, as people of name, as people, who come from Yehuda and Levi and Yosef. They're starting to lose some of their self-image. I'm going to pause the discussion here. We'll come back to it in a minute. I will apologize if I didn't get to you, because I want to keep reading. And what I want to show is that this is crucial. Before Paro comes and forgets Yosef and comes up with very harsh measures to contain the threat he believes he sees, or the threat he sees, there's a hint here in this pasuk, as you say, in pasuk Zayin, that the people are forgetting something as well. Paro's forgetfulness is explicit. We're told in the next verse, I'm reading verse 8, Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim, a new king rose over Egypt, asher lo yada et Yosef, who did not know Joseph. We're told directly and explicitly that he doesn't know what came before him, that he doesn't know them by name. He looks at these people and he doesn't see the story that brought them to this land and what they mean, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't see any of that. what he sees is something else. He sees this animalistic force filling the earth. But what Pasuk Zion hints to us, if we read it carefully and really pause there, is perhaps the people already started losing their sense of themselves as well. Of themselves as well, that they're already not seeing themselves clearly. Let's continue and see how the king of Egypt sees them. I'm going to read from verse 9. Vayomer el Amon. Hine am bnei Israel rab ve'atzum mimenu. They're too numerous. Hava nitchakma lo. Let's make a trick. Let's be smart. Pen irbe ve'aya ki tikrena milchama ונוסף גם הוא על שונאינו, ונלחם בנו, ועלה מן הארץ. Several interesting things to note here. First, Paro doesn't simply enact his draconian new measures. First, he's trying to get popular support, which is very interesting because a lot of times when we think of, Paro, the tyrant, we think of him as, someone over there, and the Egyptians have no power to alter reality. Is everything okay? Can I? Yeah.
Microphone's not working. Your microphone.
Yeah. So
Show me. Here. You can hear it.
can people in the back hear me? Is it okay? I'll try and speak up. Thank you. First of all, it's interesting that Paro, at least in the beginning of the subjugation, involves his people in it, which is interesting to note because as the story progresses, Paro is less and less interested in popular support. And he's more and more tyrannical, even in the way he handles his own people. When they are suffering, he still hardens his heart with some divine help. We'll get to that in a few weeks. And insists on continuing in the course of action that harms his own people. But here he's still using the people to help him subjugate the Israelites. Another thing that's worth noting is that the explicit fear that Paro is expressing here is military, right? He's not afraid that they're going to even rebel on their own, that the Israelites are going to start a war. He's not attributing that much power to them. He's saying, what if our enemies attack us and they betray us and help them from within? But there is another fear that's implied here. And that's in the last few words of the 10th verse when it says, Ve'ala mina aretz, and rise from the ground. It's not so clear what these words have to do with a military fear, right? It's like, it should have said maybe something like, maybe they will fight us and kick us off the land or kill us on the land. What is rising from the land to do with anything? A way to understand that is to take a step back and look at the history of the ancient world. And I know some of you already heard me talk about it in other classes, so I apologize. But in the ancient world, especially in Egypt and in the empires of Mesopotamia, empires that were built on growing grain by the great rivers, the entire hierarchy, the entire power structure of society was built on the ability of the ruling class to force the peasants, basically, to create surplus. Because the wealth of these kingdoms depended on being able to aggregate the chita, the grain, not just chita, sorry, all kinds of grains, collect them, tax them, and use the surplus as wealth for the king to then make trades with other kings, build things, et cetera, et cetera. All of that depends on the ability to force the population to keep producing that grain, right? You can't do that. So as I'm jumping a little bit ahead to box 2, the next page will come back to what we left behind. As James Scott in his book Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States points out, we're not going to read it this instant, but in a minute, because of that need to force the population to keep working and producing grain, a need that was ingrained, pun intended, in these early states, a perennial problem they had to keep dealing with was forcing the people to work. In other words, if we don't look at the biblical account and just think about for a second, but what we know about the history of the Paros and how they ruled Egypt, a problem that was constantly on the mind of every king of every one of those early states was not only what to do with this new nation that grows up in your land and fills it. The problem was how to make sure that all the people, Egyptians and Israelites alike, continue working. I'm going to read the first source here in the box too. A peasantry, assuming that it has enough to meet its basic need, will not automatically produce a surplus that elites might appropriate, but must be compelled to produce it. Under the demographic conditions of early state formation, when the means of traditional production were still plentiful and not monopolized, only through one form or another of unfree coerced labor, corvée labor, forced delivery of grain or other products, debt bondage, serfdom, communal bondage, and tribute, and various forms of slavery, was a surplus brought into being. Each of the earliest states deployed its own unique mix of coerced labor, as we shall see, but it required a delicate balance between maximizing the state surplus on the one hand and the risk of provoking the mass flight of subjects on the other, especially where there was an open frontier. You can continue reading later, it's interesting. But for now, let's keep moving on. Point being that when Paro says, I'm going back to the first box. Oh, I'm going to reread in English, verse 10. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. Perhaps we can say that he is betraying in these last words another concern. He's not merely concerned about the potential military aspect of the Israelites attacking them in conjunction with other nations. On some level, he is worried about losing them as workforce. He's scared of the way they're multiplying, but that's also an opportunity. The way they're so plentiful now and fill the earth means that here is a potential workforce that he can coerce with the aid of his own people. And this really comes back to the question of why is he consulting with his people? Why does he need to talk to his people? Why does he need to talk to his people to get them to agree with his means? It's something that we see time and time again in history with dictators and tyrants and emperors of all sorts, that the emperor, the tyrant, the dictator needs people to do things. But if they can divide and conquer, if they can get their own subjects to turn against each other and force each other to do their bidding, they will always do it because it's much simpler than maintaining constant military force over the people. In other words, if Paro had decided on these measures on his own, he would have had to extend effort to keep subjugating the Israelites and stopping them from both multiplying and running away, rising from the earth and going away. But by getting his own people involved, now every Egyptian has an invested interest in keeping the Israelites down. And this is a much more powerful and efficient way of both taking care of the military risk by turning these people into slaves and using them as military force. All of which kind of, let's put it back into the big picture of what the beginning of Shemot tells us. The beginning of Shemot shows us how a group that had names loses these names, loses its description as individuals, which is swallowed up in this description of kind of a nation that just keeps growing in animalistic terms. And then the way they are seen by the king who has power over them is also dehumanizing. They begin to lose their identity, but he entirely ignores it, their individual identity, that is. He entirely sets it aside and only sees them as bodies that have the potential to harm him or do good to him. I want to again jump historically way ahead to the first accounts, specifically of the Spaniards who arrived to the New World. Later, we have similar accounts from other nationalities, but the first accounts are from Spanish-speaking or Portuguese travelers, from Columbus onwards. And it's fascinating how at first they're describing meeting people, right? They saw these people, these natives, these wild men and women in the islands and later in the mainland of America. Very quickly, the descriptions become animalistic. Very quickly, the descriptions become, you start using terminology of subhumans, of human-like creatures. And as the Spanish conquest and invasion of America continued, this language became more and more common because it's much easier to, subjugate and kill when you don't think of people as people, when you think of them as somehow less, as somehow subhuman. Yes.
Nazis did that too.
The Nazis did that too, exactly. When you read any accounts of the Holocaust, it stands out how dehumanizing the treatment of Jews was, and how before SS soldiers were, before they could go and start shooting Jews as Einsatzgruppe in Poland and Ukraine, and later manage the camps, there were years of propaganda that described the Jews as vermin, as creepy crawlies. We see that happen time and time again. Yes.
The only thing that seems to me a little problematic to that interpretation is Paro's solution, which is kol haben hayolot hayorot hashlichut. If he really wanted them for their labor force, he would want to keep them in.
That's an excellent point. Why is he getting rid of the boys and not the girls if what he's scared about is the labor force? Anybody? I have a guess. I mean, I don't have a definitive answer, but anybody else wants to venture a thought?
The women work on a lower level,
Meaning,
housework, not field work, not production, not building.
the women do different kind of labor. Yes.
Also, the Egyptian men could sire children through the Israeli women.
Israelite woman. Yes.
Because in those
All of
days,
them had alone. Every child, not the children of Yaakov that are. It's called.
No.
Egyptian and
Mhm.
Egyptian boys are also thrown.
I don't think so. We're not even getting there today, so we'll come back to that next week, but.
And it's quite
Mhm.
jarring. If you follow the Midrashic understanding that Pharaoh was worried about somebody who was going to be
Mhm.
born to take over and organize Klal Yisrael, but he didn't know that it was necessarily going to come from.
So we'll get back to that next week when we get to that part of the tragedy of the children. I mean, it sounds horrible when I say the tragedy of the children, but throwing children into the river and killing them. We'll get to that next week and we'll circle back. I'll reread it to see what I think. But here, in answer to your question about boys and girls, I think it's kind of along these lines that you want these bodies because these bodies are useful for you. You don't want them to rise from the land. You want them, but they're dangerous because maybe they'll resist you. So get rid of this generation of boys, sire children with Egyptian men. As we know from the American case of slavery, the North American case of slavery, children of masters and slaves were still slaves. It's not but perhaps more docile, perhaps more ingrained in the system, perhaps less influence from men who still remember their tradition and might become violent. It's a form of keeping the bodies there, but removing some of their power, some of their identity. Yes.
Culture came and religion came from the male. In biblical times, so that this way by getting rid of the men,
That's
they
right.
can re-educate.
That's right. The culture and religion were defined by the men, not by the women. So you remove them even more from their sense of identity and just keep the bodies. Last comment, and then I'll continue.
In terms, if he's afraid that they're going to rise up. Women generally in those days did not rise up and rebel.
Correct.
They didn't have
Women
the power.
Women didn't rebel usually. Also, we again, taking and putting it in context of the ancient world in general, it's pretty clear that women were treated often as chattel, not only slave women. There, it was very ingrained. It's to be expected that a woman, joins a different household and then accepts that, is loyal to them, whether it's through respectful marriage or because she's a captive, a shayafat Torah, right, taken in war, or a slave woman. So it's less of a threat, but we can retouch on that discussion next week when we talk about the massacre of the children. Let's continue reading for a moment and put it in the context of what is the slavery that we're seeing. We heard Paro talking to his people. We heard him making his arguments and getting his people to be on board with the very active subjugation of this nation that scares him. And now what we see is something very interesting, because we see a tension. We will read it in a second. We see a tension between what the Egyptians do to the Israelites and what happens to the Israelites in turn. Let's read in verse Yud Aleph 11. Vayasimu alav sirei misim leman anoto besivlotam. They set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Vayven arei miskenot leparo et Pitom ve'et Ramses. They built garrison cities for Paro, Pitom, and Ramses. V'kaasher ye'anu oto ken irbe v'chen ifrotz. Vayakutzu mipnei bnei Israel. And here is the interesting thing. We heard them described as this animalistic force, right? That creepy crawlies its way into multitudinous. Now we see that being an animalistic force might be an advantage sometimes, because here they are being oppressed, being made to work really hard. But what we hear is that the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Now it's no longer just Paro being scared. Now the Egyptians on the street are scared of them, because what they see is that these people were beaten and forced and enslaved and drained from their, so to speak, life force almost. Their life force, their ability to procreate actually only grows. Maybe it's a silver lining for this new image of the people as almost a force of nature. I'm going to keep reading here in 13. ויעבידו מצרים את בני ישראל בפרך, וימררו את חייהם בעבודה קשה, בחומר ובלבנים, ובכל עבודה בשדה, את כל עבודתם אשר עבדו בהם בפרך. Within 14 psukim, that's it, just 14 psukim, that's all we covered right now. The people lost their names, the people lost their freedom, their status. They lost their identity as shapers of their own fate, as someone mentioned before, as people who have control over their own time, over their own fate, over their own self-image. But it's remarkable, and this is really the main point I want to take away from today, that the first thing they lose is the names. Before they lose their freedom, before they lose their self-determination, before they become so derided, first by Paro, and then by his people, that they lose their status and their freedoms, they lose the names. I think that's why this book starts with the Shemot, and very appropriately we use that beginning to name the whole book Shemot, because before we can talk about regaining freedom, or in parallel to talking about regaining freedom, we have to talk about how can these people regain their names. Because until they regain their names, until they become individuals, as long as they're defined by the way they are seen as this mass of bodies for labor and not as people with all that it entails, it doesn't matter if you remove the subjugation. It doesn't matter if you remove Paro from above them. How on earth are they supposed to function as a nation? Let alone a nation that is covenanted with God, etc., is supposed to be a light unto the nations, etc. Freedom is not just about losing the yoke. Freedom is also about losing the way you're defined, not by your own choice and your own action, but by how you are seen as part of a group. And what we will see in this course, what we will keep looking for very carefully, is how every time that God is taking a measure to liberate the Israelites, he's also taking a measure to help them find themselves. Later, we will see in the end of the second chapter of Shemot. I'm in box number 3 in the second page, sorry. That they don't lose merely their names, they also lose language. They also lose the ability to express themselves. Now, of course, I have to say something important. I'm not saying that the historical Israelites were mute and couldn't talk. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that from the storytelling perspective, from the way the storyteller is shaping the story, he's showing us this gradual loss through the way they're portrayed. And if first they lose names and then they lose freedom, by the end of the second chapter, they can no longer even express themselves. I'm reading now in box 3. In those days, the king of Egypt died. Now, again, if we're reading the story for the first time, we might get hopeful at this moment. We might say, oh, great, things are about to get better for them. But this expectation is frustrated. They were groaning from the work. They cried out. Their cry for help from bondage rose up to God. ויזכור אלוקים את בריתו את אברהם ואת יצחק ואת יעקב, וירא אלוקים את בני ישראל, וידע אלוקים. So, on the one hand, it looks great. This is the turning point, right? Here we see how these people who were lost and enslaved and suffering, we see God making up his mind to help them, which, I mean, God already worked hard in Genesis to establish himself as, able to change history in many directions. So at this point, we, the readers, can sigh in relief and assume that the story is about to end soon. But it's not going to end soon. It's going to take quite a lot of time and chapters to reach the point that they're actually free. And the Midrash points out that perhaps, or I'm pointing out what the Midrash is pointing out, that part of why it's going to take so long is implied in these 3 verses, because they don't actually pray. They don't say, God, save us. They don't say, God, help us. They groan, they moan, they sigh. The Rabbi Aviva Zorenberg uses the Midrash to say that in Mitzrayim, it's a Hasidic term, in Mitzrayim, the people were not merely enslaved, they were also in what the Hasidim called Galut HaDibur, the exile of speech. In other words, they're losing their power of speech. And a lot of the story later is about renewing the power of speech. And the power of speech is particularly important here because speech is more than just, the ability to express yourself eloquently when you just talk to other people. That's nice, but that's not the point. Speech means the ability to shape your own experience. Sorry. Can you hear me in the back? I can't tell if it's working. Okay, thank you. To shape your own experience into something that can be shared with another human soul. Think about it. Until we speak, our experiences, how we experience the world is locked within us. No one can really read another person's mind. We can try and read another person's body language and guess at what they need or think or want at this moment. But these are very, I'm not even sure what word to use, vulgar, coarse aspects of human experience, the way we really feel, the way we experience things, the way we think about ourselves and about our circumstances, why we want what we want, the why of everything. All of that is lost and locked within us if we can't express it. So to say that someone is losing the power of speech, that the whole group of people is losing the power of speech, means that their enslavement goes so deep that they're not only losing their control over their time, over what they do, over the products of their labor, they're also losing control over how they want to represent themselves on the most basic level in the world. In a sense, it's almost as if they don't exist publicly. Their private worlds exist within them, but on a public level, how they see things doesn't exist, doesn't have any expression. So when God hears their moan and attributes to it, turns it into prayer, takes it and says, it's good enough, it's prayer, I'm answering that. God is showing his kindness, but it's almost a last ditch effort. Because by now, it's not even clear who is there to be saved. We don't know who these people are anymore. And a lot of what Chumash Shemot, and then Chumash Vayikra, and then Chumash Bamidbar and Dvarim are going to be about is about us and them discovering it in turn. We have almost 15 minutes left. And before I have some points to make before we conclude today's lesson, I want to open the floor to questions, remarks. Yes.
I looked at this as if they were groaning and complaining, but they had no relationship to God either. And the only reason God saved them was his memory of the bridge he made. Had nothing to do with what they were doing. It had to do with the bridge Hashem made with Abraham, and therefore he was going to save them finally. You know, and their groaning was just a reminder to him. I don't think they had any communication or need or desire to communicate. They lost that ability to communicate with the Kadosh Baruch Hu.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. What's your name?
Tina.
Tina is making an excellent point that they're not even directing their moaning towards God. Forget that it's wordless. It's not even directional. There's no moment, there's no address that they're turning to, which is a very, thank you for pointing it out. It's a very important aspect of it, that communication is not just about the ability to express your inner internal world. It's also about making connections. And it really seems as if there's no connection there at this point. Yes.
The text actually strengthens it because Vata'al Shavatam El Elokim, it's passive, it's not active. They are, it's what you said, but it's right here in the text.
Correct. That they're not mitponim le'elokim. It's like then their cries rose to God, like this passive weird description. That's an excellent point. Thank you. Yes.
About how many years are we talking about? How many generations between the time of Yosef and the new Paro who wants to enslave the Jews? It was 100 years, 200 years?
That's an excellent question. How much time passed between the enslavement and the new part, like the getting worse?
The old Israel and the new.
Yeah, the beginning of their subjugation and the kind of radical, what's the word? Haslama. Escalation. Yeah, thank you. That happens in the end of chapter 2. I would like to look into it. I have in my mind some answers that I saw in the Midrash. I don't want to say it now. I'll try and.
Truly have no idea.
Yeah.
I think it's close to years.
Does anybody remember what the Midrash says?
Supposed to be 400 years in
Mhm.
and the Hashem Chishev and Haketz, so he shortened it.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
you know,
I think 210. Yeah, I think, but 210 is not until the worsening. 210 is until they come out.
It was 3 pharaohs from the time that the first pharaoh liked us very much, and then gave land, Goshen, and then his son, his grandson was horrible, Mr. Horrible.
Thank you. Sorry, what's your name?
My name is Ellen.
Evelyn. Thank you, Evelyn, for pointing it.
Ellen, not Evelyn.
Sorry, it feels like Bat Kol is talking here to resolve our questions. So thank
Yeah,
you.
I've been painting all morning. It's definitely Bat Kol.
Thanks. So yeah, so in the Pshat, it really looks like it's 3 pairs. I've seen Parshanim who thinks that there are more that are not mentioned. I'll look into it before next week to give a more thorough answer, but it's we know that there's 210 years from the subjugation to the release. Not so clear exactly how they're divided. Also, the Makot take a while, right? So it's not so clear. Other questions, comments? Okay, anybody in the Zoom? Anybody in the Bat Kol category? Okay, so I have a few comments to say before we close today's session, okay?
Excuse me.
Yes.
I was just wondering why it was necessary for them to bring the new pharaoh in, that the pharaoh died and then another pharaoh came in. I mean, it's just a continuation of the same story. Why do we care which pharaoh it is?
You're asking, okay, I'll just repeat the question, that why do we hear about the death of the Paro and the rise of the new Paro? Why is it important? I mean, it's not a history book, like we said, it's a story that's meant to teach us something, that's meant to show us something. So why is this a relevant story? Rashi, by the way, is also bothered by that and famously says that, sorry, if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to just say, but Rashi is also bothered by that. And I think he says that because of the death of one Paro and the next Paro was more concerned. And I think he says that the Paro was sick and therefore bathed in the blood of Jewish babies. This is a whole midrashic tradition that surrounds. You remember something else? You kept nodding. No. There's a whole midrashic tradition that tries to deal with this fact. I want to suggest a slightly different perspective that has less to do with, what our traditions about it are and more about storytelling, again, because that's really the angle I'm focusing on here, and about the nature of memory. The first king who rose and forgot about Joseph, didn't know Joseph, right? As Aviva Zorenberg points out, not knowing someone is a pointed remark. It's kind of almost like repressing this knowledge. It's not he forgot. It's not his memories dwindled over time. It's he didn't know Joseph. It implies a certain acts of repression and the Midrash also says that there's some of the Midrash at any rate, some of the Chachamim say that it's not that he forgot, it's that he chose not to know. He set aside the knowledge of Joseph because it interfered with his political agenda and what he wanted to achieve in the situation. So he set it aside as uncomfortable knowledge that shouldn't be considered. It's censored. He censored his own mind and his people's memory. Whether we want to read it as strongly or not knowing Joseph, but still being one generation removed, means that some people still remember Joseph. Some people, the Israelites themselves probably still had some memory of their past. But before we hit the climax of the story, before we hit the Paro who is truly dedicated to subjugating the people completely, we see a generational shift. And as we know about the nature of memory, when one generation, if in one generation they still kind of remember something, but it's not actively spoken knowledge, by the next generation, they're not going to know it already at all. So what we're seeing here is a cleansing of the lingering memories that might still hold Paro back or be something that, kind of makes the Egyptians embarrassed about subjugating the descendants of Joseph. The storyteller is guiding us to note that there's a gradual worsening of the situation. Something that might shed light on it is, I actually brought it, it's here ahead in box 8, page 5, box 8, is a later story, a much later story that takes place in the book of Judges. The book of Judges starts, I'm here in the second source of box 8. The book of Judges start when the people fail to conquer all of the land of Israel. And that's a problem. But then things get worse when that generation dies. I'm reading here in Judges 2:10. V'gam kol hador hahu ne'esfu el avotav, and all the generation were likewise gathered to their fathers. Vayakam dor acher achrem, another generation arose after them, which had not experienced the deliverance of the Lord. But in Hebrew it says asher lo yad'u et Hashem. It's a clear allusion to the Paro asher lo yada et Yosef. V'gam et ha'maaseh asher asa l'Yisrael. They don't remember what God. They don't remember God, they don't know God, and they don't remember what he did for Israel. And for that moment, the forgetfulness leads to straying away from God and then being punished by God letting other nations overcome us, and then groaning and moaning until God relieves us. And that cycle of that interminable and horrible cycle of the book of Judges. But here too, we see that the forgetfulness, the full forgetfulness, takes time. The first generation that comes into Israel doesn't quite fulfill all their duties, but they're not forgetting yet. Then a new generation comes that forgets. And we see again that this process of leaving history behind is gradual. So I hope that answers the question about why I think
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much.
important to have another pearl. Okay, so we're running out of time, so I want to make a few kind of concluding remarks just to set the stage as to what we're doing next week and where we're going from here. Sefer Shemot, on one level, is focused on getting us out of Egypt and out of slavery and back into a place of namefulness. I know it's not actually a word, forgive me, and having an identity that allows us to become a people. And a lot of what we're going to do in this course is follow that process and really kind of pick apart every stage and see how it addresses both of these big losses, the loss of freedom and the loss of names and language that comes with it. But there's another story, a deeper story that's being told to us. And it kind of involves us reading it. Because and I'll explain what I mean. Part of the kind of program or the agenda that shapes the Chumashim, specifically from Shemot till the end of Dvarim, is to teach us not to be Egypt. Not to be Egypt. To teach us how not to be, not merely how not to be the slaves in Egypt, but how not to be like the Egyptians who enslaved us. As just a moment. As Rabbi Sachs says, and in box 4 in his book Ceremony and Celebration, the journey to the promised land has to pass through Egypt, because Israel was to construct a society that would be the antithesis of Egypt. Therefore, they had to know Egypt, experience Egypt, feel it in their bones, carry it with them as an indelible memory that they would hand on to all future generations. They had to experience what it was like to be on the wrong side of power. The taste of that affliction was never to be forgotten. Rabbi Soloveitchik, in his book about vision and leadership, a beautiful book about Joseph and Moses, if you didn't get a chance to read it, I strongly recommend it, makes a similar yet complementary, different point, where he says that as long as they were just, at home in Canaan with their father, the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, couldn't appreciate the meaning of their own religion. The things God asked them to do mean something. What God wants them to do is to establish Chevrat Mofet, a city upon a hill, so to speak. A light unto the nations in the sense that it's a society that's built on different principles, not on might makes right, not on treating other people as less than human if it serves your needs. But until they saw it done, they couldn't appreciate the significance of their own religion. And when we understand that, when we understand that what we're supposed to learn from this story is not just how we became a nation, but also how we have to be a nation that isn't going to become the villain of the piece, then suddenly the way Paro dismisses them as individuals and treats them as, a resource is a very dire warning for us as a powerful, sovereign, named nation in our own right. And what part of what we're going to do in following weeks is see both how the ancient Israelites are pulled out of namelessness and subjugation, and how the story pointedly guides us not to fall into the same trap that the Egyptians did. And yes?
What was the book about Soloveitchik where?
Vision and Leadership. I think a new translation into Hebrew just came out recently, if you prefer to read it. And on that note, I want to wish you all a wonderful day of learning and otherwise. And thank you so much for coming. I'm really honored and privileged. Thank you.